Now let me introduce, or perhaps reintroduce, Eduventures has used a version of this chart for some time, but its origins go back to another firm, Gartner Group. But it's the well-known hype cycle. So the idea that a new technology appears, there's often great enthusiasm, adoption, rising to this peak of inflated expectations, meaning a lot more is expected of the technology a lot faster than is actually realistic. Then there's some sort of bust where we go down into the trough of disillusionment, where everyone suddenly takes the opposite view, saying, "Well, my goodness, we were fooled. This is actually no good at all," and it's rejected. It's sort of an excessive skepticism about it rather than excessive enthusiasm. But then gradually over time, less hyped, less visible, we move up what's called the slope of enlightenment, where providers start to work out the true nature of the innovation, its true application, work through all kinds of teething problems, and gradually reach the plateau of productivity, meaning we've now got to the point where we're extracting significant but ultimately now rather mature value out of the technology, and it's played its role. It was not as wonderful as we thought, but equally it wasn't as useless as we thought either. And the reason I raise this is, where is online higher education today, and what do we mean by online higher education today? You could argue that online, and I'll use the standard jargon now, online version 1.0, meaning online programs as we've come to understand them over the last decade, again, typically text-based chat, some decorative multimedia. You could argue, we went through this hype cycle, the beginning of this hype cycle in the late 1990s, and now perhaps we're approaching that plateau of productivity. Perhaps there is little more pedagogic value or organizational value from an institutional point of view that we can squeeze out of that version of online. But clearly today we are in the midst, you could argue, of another peak of inflated expectations. There are new kinds of online, MOOCs and related activity in particular, that you could argue are at that peak of inflated expectations. The idea that we can suddenly move from very expensive programs to free programs, very lengthy degrees to very short, impactful courses, consolidated supply under a few top faculty, few top schools, rather than more and more schools rushing into the market of all shapes and sizes. But equally, is it actually realistic? Is there a business model here? Is there really demand? Is this really transformative, as opposed to just a new form of continuing education that will often serve the most privileged, the best educated, rather than those that are actually at the heart of policy concern around higher education impact? So online, I think, is arguably going back to the beginning, and the very fact that we're back to this period of a peak of inflated expectations does point to, again, some weaknesses in online version 1.0. It is too expensive. It does take too long. The experience often isn't compelling enough. The outcomes often are not clear or are not as compelling as we would like, given all the hype around online, both back in the 90s and again today. So MOOCs and their fellow pretenders to the online throne are challenging head-on some of these weaknesses, but as new ventures, as startups trading on venture capital, they've yet to really be tested, yet to have to really prove themselves, and there's a lot of questions. But what's not a question is that MOOCs and so forth send a very strong signal to conventional online or traditional online. We can now use such terms. That tells you how far we've come, how mature the online market is in relative terms. They ask tough questions of conventional ways of doing things.